It's for what? Oh, I mean, I am twitching this at the same time. Is that people still use Twitch? Is that still a thing? Yeah. I've never heard of Discord. Well, anyway, make sure everyone is on. All right. Good to see everyone. Welcome to class 7 of our series, As It Is Written. And so we're going to 10-week series. So we have one next week, and then we'll have 2 more in January before we shift gears to a new series. We will not be meeting on New Year's Sunday, the 3rd, but we'll finish up pretty soon after that. So thank you for following along. Today we're finishing our, I'm going to do this, and you can, that'd be pretty sweet. It's like I'll just do, anyway, it's like from afar, but it's actually Caleb. You're swiping? Yeah, my virtual swiping. We're in part 2 of the second chunk that we're going through in terms of how the Old Testament is a witness to Christ. We're going to particularly be looking at his humanity today, but why don't I pray for us? And if anyone is free, if they could close those doors in the back, that'd be super helpful. But I'll pray, and you can walk while I pray. It's okay. Lord, we thank you for our time together today. We thank you for the privilege it is to learn with each other and to study your word in this way. Thank you for Christ and the manifold way he has revealed to us in his word, and that we meet with him there. And so we ask that you would stir us up this morning to greater understanding and fellowship with him in Christ's name. Amen. All right. As mentioned last week, we looked at how the Old Testament, I just gave you like a sliver of it. I wanted to do more, but we only have 30 minutes, of how the Old Testament anticipates the divinity of Christ as God the Son. He's both Son of God and God the Son. Today we're going to take a look at his humanity. Now, this is an almost impossible task to cover this in 30 minutes. As you can imagine, the Old Testament has a lot to say about Christ as our human Savior. And so we are going to, I'm going to sort of zoom in on one particular passage, and then I'm going to hit you with a bunch of others. I wish we could go into detail on all of them, but we can't because of time. But you'll at least get a feel for the breadth of the Old Testament witness to who Christ is. And I want to start with Matthew 16:14. And this is just one example of a couple in the Gospels where you have either Jesus prompting it, sometimes Herod does it, or there's just sort of rumblings about who exactly is this guy. And in fact, right out of the gate in John's Gospel, when Jesus has barely done anything in his human ministry, and they're like, oh, wait a second, we found the Messiah. We found this special person. Who is this guy? And Jesus, at this point in Matthew 16, you also have the parallels in Mark and Luke. He actually sort of turns the tables to his disciples and he's like, all right, well, what are the rumors going around about me? Who are they saying that I am? You know, they seem to heal. I've been teaching parables. I taught on the mountain. I've raised the dead and all these other things. So who are people? This is sort of word on the street about who I am. And this is what his disciples say are the rumors going around about who Jesus is. They said, some say John the Baptist. Now, why would they say John the Baptist? What has happened to John the Baptist in the meantime? Yeah, he's dead. And so that shows me actually that they're profoundly confused. Like, wait a second, Jesus was with John the Baptist. How could he be John the Baptist? But it shows you that they're kind of confused about, okay, maybe he's John the Baptist come back to life. Who is this guy? Others say Elijah. Now, why might they say Elijah? Well, he also, he was taken up in a whirlwind chariot to heaven. And so there's this sort of mystery surrounding his end of existence. But there's another more particular reason why they might guess Elijah. Exactly. Essentially, the very last prophecy of the Old Testament in Malachi chapter 4 says, I will send you Elijah on the great day of the Lord. So there's this expectation that the never actually died Elijah might come back. Others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets. In other words, there was a variety of expectations about who is going to come and do something. And I've actually just given you a list of bullets here. If you look at Jewish writings between the ending of the Old Testament and the coming of the New Testament, the coming of Jesus, there wasn't, this may be surprising to some, there wasn't a uniform understanding that everyone agreed on as to what the quote-unquote Messiah would be. I think that's our common misconception, that, everyone expected the Messiah to be this. So there's sort of a standard job description of what this messianic deliverer is going to do. It's actually not true. If you look at the writings that we have from this era, and in fact, if you look at the very thing we just looked at, right? There's multiple opinions about who Jesus could be. there were a lot of diverse opinions. And I have a book coming out on this, and you can buy this in April when it comes out, all 750 pages of glory that deal with this intertestamental Jewish expectation. And so you can add that to your Christmas list, but it'll come out in April. And so just to run through it, many Jews didn't expect a Messiah at all. They just thought we're going to continue keeping Torah, and lots of writings make no mention of the end of the age, no mention of a king coming back. It's just let's do Torah and let's happily go about our business. Some expected a king Messiah from the line of David. Some actually expected a priest Messiah. There's whole writings about a priestly Messiah coming, not a king, but someone who's going to be the sort of great new Levi or the great new Aaron. And in fact, somewhat scandalously, when these were discovered in the 1940s from the Dead Sea area, some of the Dead Sea Scrolls talk about two Messiahs. They actually speak of a kingly and a priestly together doing something. Some more focused on a prophet figure who's going to come. Melchizedek, Enoch, and Elijah have very interesting backstory, very interesting, legacies in the scholarship. And then some make a big deal more like angels are going to do. There's a whole cast list of angels beyond just, who are the two named angels in the Bible? Michael and Gabriel. There's a whole bunch, Uriel and Saphiel and Raphael and a whole bunch of others. And so the point of this is there's a bunch of diverse expectations about what sort of figure is going to come and save the world. Does that make sense where we are? Now, when Jesus comes on the scene, and as we've already established from Matthew, there's this swirl of, okay, well, who's this guy? What sort of role does he fit? Where do you think the disciples mainly go to sort it out? Do they go to the Dead Sea Scrolls? Do they sort of start speculating, oh, maybe he's this or maybe he's that? What do they mainly do? We'll go to the next slide. They go to the Old Testament. So this is most clear in John 1:45, but we can start at John 1:41. And so notice it's John 1, and so we're not too far into the story. Andrew, who will later become an apostle, says, we found the Messiah. He doesn't really know why he thinks that necessarily, but his buddy Philip, who also becomes a disciple, he sort of pinpoints why they think he's this figure. And he says this, we have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth. Now, what are some observations you can make about this little conclusion that Philip comes to? I mean, they just spent one night with the guy, actually. They had just met Jesus. They had dinner that night in John 1, and all of a sudden they come to the conclusion, it's the right answer, that he's this Messiah written about in the Old Testament. Now, what are some observations you make about it? Okay, good. So Moses in the law are the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Yep.
Well, they're convinced that Moses in the law wrote and the prophets wrote Jesus, and that Jesus would use the Old Testament to explain to them who he really is.
Good. So, and actually there's 2, and you can go to the next slide. There's 2 observations that you can make. First, if they're thinking, who is this guy? How do I sort out who this guy is? Or like if a celebrity walks into the room, right, and everyone's like taking pictures, like, I don't know who that guy is. So you're like, let me go to Wikipedia and figure out who this guy is. So their Wikipedia is the Old Testament, where they go to try to figure out what is his identity. And then later on, Jesus will do the same thing. At the end of his ministry, he's going to go to the Old Testament to explain who he is. In other words, the Old Testament is central to helping us understand his identity. And the other observation that you would make is that they don't specifically cite a passage. That's what's so interesting about that Nathaniel or that Philip quotation. He doesn't say, look, as it is written in Genesis 49 or Numbers 24 or Daniel 7 or 2 Samuel. He just says, look, we don't really know. I mean, he doesn't point us to any particular passage. Like the whole thing is about him. And so what I want to try to unfold this morning is what are some of the places that may have been in their mind that actually become explicit in the New Testament as framing the identity of Jesus? Is that a question? Yeah, Sue. Yeah, next slide. Well, that's where we're going to go, yes. The interesting thing about that John 1 thing is that the John 1 passage is that he hasn't actually really done a whole lot yet. Other than, create the world and sustain all things. But in terms of his incarnate ministry, he's just come on the scene. And so it's like they spent one night with the guy. They immediately conclude, wait, we think he might be the Messiah. And they say, well, the Old Testament said so, but they're not pinpointing yet where, but we get that as you read the Gospels in a whole bunch of ways. And that's what I'm going to try to show. And so I'm going to give you 7 different, we're not going to obviously go through them all in detail. What I would argue are 7 different Old Testament expectations or frameworks that Jesus explicitly fulfills in the New Testament that construe his identity as human. Last week we looked at his identity as divine. And of course we confess it if you're here this morning in our confession of faith that he is both divine and human in one person. So we're going to look at how he is the incarnate one, how he is the prophet, not just a prophet, but the consummate prophet, how he is messianic king. You may be wondering, wait a second, I thought Messiah was the whole category. It's like, no, actually, that's a specific category. He's both priest and sacrifice. He is covenant mediator, which sums up, actually, prophet, priest, and king. He's the Son of Man, and he is the vindicated sufferer. And so, and there's probably more you could add. The righteous one is one theme, or the coming one, but those are the main 7 that we're going to look at this morning. So let's take a look at the incarnate one. It's Christmas time. Someone says, wait a second, why do you believe that Jesus was God incarnate in the flesh? Where would you go? Okay, John 1. Well, let me phrase it differently. Where would you go in the Old Testament to prove that Jesus is the incarnate one? John 1 doesn't explicitly cite the Old Testament. We looked at it last week, though, that has the creational language from Genesis 1. The first one okay, Melody, yeah. Yes, Isaiah chapter 7. Anyone know the verse? Yes, Isaiah 7:14. And what is it? Which always creates an awkward pause when you read this passage with small kids. Mom, what's a virgin? Yeah, the virgin shall conceive. What does conception mean? And have a child, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Now, this is explicitly cited in Matthew 1:22 through 23. Whenever he describes the incarnation of Jesus in the womb of the Virgin Mary, it directly goes to Isaiah 7:14. Now, Luke also has a miraculous conception, but he doesn't explicitly cite Isaiah. He just sort of alludes to it, but it's explicit in Matthew. There's 2 other, it was actually 3 others, but I'll just give you 2. Psalm 8 is an interesting one. Does anyone know what's going on in Psalm 8 as it is used in Hebrews 2:9? Psalm 8 is one of those kind of cryptic, messianic-ish, Jesus anticipating Psalms. He was made for a little while lower than the angels. So Hebrews 2 goes through the fact that even though Jesus is better than angels, even though he's creator of all things, we saw that last week, by the way, God calls Jesus God in Hebrews 1. Whenever he explains the work of Jesus in Hebrews 2, he goes to Psalm 8 and says, look, even though he's creator of all things, even though he's the most important being in all, creation and so forth, and isn't actually, he didn't come to be. He's always been in existence. He was made for a little while lower than the angels in his humanity. And then it explains that as so that he could offer himself for humans and die for them. So Psalm 8 is an interesting one. That if you read Psalm 8, you wouldn't necessarily think, oh, this is talking about the incarnation, but that's how it's used in Hebrews. And then lastly, Revelation 12 has this very bizarre scene where you have a woman who's pregnant. She's sort of this astral heavenly woman, and she's about to give birth to a son, and they are being assailed by a dragon. What does that sound like? You got a woman who's going to have a son or an offspring who's male. He's going to rule all the nations, and a dragon/serpent is trying to get after him. What does that sound like? It's Genesis 3:15. Genesis 3:15 is this curse upon the serpent and says, look, the woman's going to have an offspring who's going to wage war with your offspring, the serpent. And so that's another place in the Old Testament that is in a very shadowy way anticipating that this person who's going to come is going to be an offspring, an actual human offspring of the woman. Does that make sense? There's other places we could go for the incarnation, but those are 3 big ones: Isaiah 7, Psalm 8, and Genesis 3. And I said that we were going to do 4, and so here's the 4th one. And we're going to spend a little bit of time on this one because it helps explain some of the stuff that's part of the theme of this class. So Hebrews 10, 5 through 7. And I'll read it for us. Reads this. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, what is that a summary of? Yeah, that's Christmas, okay? He said, that's pretty interesting. Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure. So then I said, behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book. All right, so there's a whole lot here that we can unpack, but what's the most important observation at first that we need to make? Okay, body's part of it, but before we even get to the body question, what is this? It's a quotation. In fact, it's a direct citation because he says Christ said it. So what should we do? Look in your footnotes, and does anyone know where this is from? And I know you're looking at the slides, and so you're like, well, I don't have my Bible open. Anyone? It's from Psalm 40. And so what would we do? We would go and take a look at Psalm 40. And if you read, Psalm 40 is a great psalm, by the way, and I haven't mentioned this to Tanner recently. I think I did it maybe 2 years ago. U2 has a fantastic version of Psalm 40, and I've been lobbying to have that as part of our worship service, and I've obviously lost that battle. So there's a whole bunch going on in Psalm 40. But Psalm 40 is about trusting in the Lord. And in particular, Psalm 40 is about the importance of a heart that is dedicated to God, and how that is more important than sort of this ritualistic, rote, going through the motions of offering animal sacrifices. And 40 verses 6 through 7 are the two verses that are quoted in Hebrews. If you look them up in your ESV, NIV, KJV, what have you, here's how verse 46 would read. God has given me an open ear. And in fact, it's something like he has dug for me an open ear. But let's go back to Hebrews. What is, if you go left, actually, yeah. Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. What's different? Ear versus body. And that's the main difference in this quotation. Does anyone know what's going on here? It's one of the more complicated ones in all the New Testament in terms of the use of the Old. Yeah. They are, yes. So if you go 2 more slides over, Caleb. Hebrews, the author of Hebrews is using the Greek Old Testament here. And the Greek Old Testament, instead of having ears dug, it says body prepared. So you see that in the second bullet. And there's a whole bunch of debate about why that is and who came up with that. My general opinion is that the translator of the Psalms, so this is, call it 200 BC, something like that, that translator was unpacking the metaphor. Most likely this digging ears for me either is a part-to-whole relationship, so the ears represent your body, or it could even represent what happens to someone who's sort of branded or pierced for you to show you that you're their slave. And maybe the audience wouldn't understand that, so he said, well, look, it's the whole body that's being prepared and in service and so forth. That's probably what's happening, but again, we don't have a decisive answer for that. But what's more important in terms of the flow is that Hebrews 10 is about how the sacrificial system of the Old Testament, while great, right, and while pointing towards Jesus, was ultimately insufficient. Why in Hebrews 10 is the Old Testament sacrificial system of rams and goats and pigeons and so forth, why does it not actually do its job? Okay, it's perpetual, it never ends. It happens every year. That's part of it. And why is it perpetual? Why does it never end? Okay, so rituals don't fundamentally change your heart, but what's the big conclusion in Hebrews 10, part of 9? What can't take your place? Animals can't take your place. That's the big aha moment. There's part of it that it's every year and you keep sinning. But the problem with the Levitical system, even though it was put in place by God, is that animals can't replace you. And so what his point is this, what the Hebrews point is, in Psalm 40, that was already anticipated. The psalmist says, look, you're not fundamentally about animal sacrifices. It's not like you're some strange God who just wants to smell burning flesh on the grill, as wonderful as that is. Or what's the new vegetable beef, impossible meat or whatever? Okay, fine, whatever. Maybe that smells good too. But Hebrews is saying, look, Psalm 40 was already anticipating that the system of animal sacrifices is insufficient because what needs to atone for you is a human. So then put it all together. What does the author of Hebrews say about Psalm 40? Did you catch it when we read it? When he came into the world, what? thus said David? Nope. What does he say? He said. So who is speaking Psalm 40, actually, according to Hebrews? Christ himself. In fact, it's mentioned twice. Christ is speaking the psalm, and he's saying, look, according to the Old Testament, I needed a body for two reasons. What are the two reasons that Christ needed a body? A body you have prepared for me. When I came into the world, I took on a body for two reasons. What are they? All right, so where animals failed, I'm going to succeed by offering my own body. So that's part of what Psalm 40 is about. And then broadly speaking, if Psalm 40 is about how God actually wants our heartfelt obedience, why else did Jesus take on a body? It's not just to die on the cross, although that's true. To be obedient to God, exactly. It's a very fascinating little extra bit there that we often forget. He says, look, a body you prepared for me, because the sacrificial system wasn't going to cut it. Behold, I've come to do what? I've come to do your will. And so the incarnation of Jesus, according to Hebrews 10, according to Psalm 40, you see it's complicated, right? Is to accomplish a twofold objective, to be the human body that could actually successfully atone for you because you're a human body, but also to perfectly do the will of God. And both of those two are sort of the theme of Psalm 40. So you go and study Psalm 40, that's the kind of thrust you'll get, waiting for a better solution to the problems. That makes sense? That's a complicated move. Hebrews 10 is very complicated. It's pretty fascinating too. So y'all with me on that. All right, let's move on to the next one. The prophets. Name some prophets from the Old Testament. Just throw them out there. Prophets. Isaiah, Elijah, Micah, and Micaiah, by the way. Different guy. Amos, yeah, so we have several major prophets, several minor prophets, and the few that actually didn't write anything down, like Elijah, Elisha, and so on. And before we ever get to the prophets, Moses makes a prediction in Deuteronomy 18:15. He says, God will at some point send you a prophet from among your brothers, better than me, and it is to him you shall listen. And that's the starting point of this entire expectation that there's going to be a better prophet figure come. And in Acts 3:22, who is Deuteronomy 18:15 applied to? And what's always the answer when you ask vague questions like that? Jesus. So Acts 3:22 directly applies Deuteronomy 18 to Jesus and says, look, he's the one Moses was talking about. If you want to understand part of the identity of Jesus, he's the greater prophet that Moses talked about. I don't know, 18 or 1700 years prior. Does that make sense? We're not going to get into it in detail, but that's a big one. Now, another place that this prophecy shows up is actually in the transfiguration. Who speaks to Jesus during the transfiguration? God. And he says, you are my beloved son. But then God speaks to everyone else in the transfiguration, because there's other people who are witnessing, including Elijah and Moses. And he says, listen to him. And that is also from Deuteronomy 18:15. This prophet who's going to come, he's going to come from Israel, and you shall listen to him. So that's a subtle little way Deuteronomy 18 shows up. So in other words, God quotes himself to define the identity of Jesus as prophet. While, by the way, Moses is there at the Mount of Transfiguration. Moses wrote that, right? And now you have God quoting Moses to describe who's the better prophet than Moses or Elijah ever could be. Jesus himself. That's pretty cool. But Jesus himself also, at the beginning of his ministry, at his when he visits his hometown synagogue, and they are just like super excited to have him, and then try to kill him. He reads 2 verses and has essentially like a 5-word sermon. Does anyone know what his sermon is? Yeah, today these words are fulfilled in your hearing. And we're like, that would be the shortest SoundCloud recording ever, right? It'd just be like so short. He drops the mic and they try to kill him. But his sermon text is Isaiah 61. And so Isaiah 61 is about this future prophet-like figure that God is going to anoint with his spirit to go and proclaim good news to the poor and recovery of sight to the blind, the day of liberation from prison and so forth. And then Jesus says, as he's just read Isaiah 61, he says, that's me. So even Jesus used the Old Testament to define himself as the great, consummate, spirit-anointed prophet. Well, what about Messianic king? What does Messiah mean? And this is where we actually run into some difficulty, because we have a whole lot of different ways that in modern world we define Messiah. You know, Neo's the Messiah, the Mandalorian's the Messiah. See a Messiah figure? I don't know. I don't watch Star Trek. So what does Messiah mean? Anointed or anointed one. And in the Old Testament, anointing language is typically used for priests and kings. So even Saul, for instance, is called the anointed of the Lord. Various priests are anointed. Occasionally, prophets are not usually sort of anointed with oil, but and as mentioned at the beginning, there is a group of Jews who are sort of hyper anticipating a prophet figure who's going to come and do these great things. But the main thrust in the Old Testament is that the king is the one who's the sort of consummate anointed one. And who's the prototype king in the Old Testament? It's not Saul, he was bad. Who's the sort of, David himself. And at the end of his life, they declare, look, David is the 2 Samuel 23. He is the true anointed of God, right? And so that's where anointed language gets very laden with meaning as to this Davidic king who is sent by God and rules over his people. And in the intertestamental period, so this is from the Dead Sea Scrolls, this Messiah language, either Mashiach or Christos, is, again, mostly used for king figures in the intertestamental period, but there are some exceptions to that. And so when we get to Jesus, where does messianic kingship show up in the life of Jesus to explain who he is? Where's the first time we see it, actually? You open the first page in the New Testament, what do you read? The genealogy, this is the book of the genealogy of Jesus, the son of David. That's the first time you see it. It's like, why David? Well, because he was the anointed king. You see the same thing in Luke's genealogy. Bethlehem, why Bethlehem? Why was he born in Bethlehem as opposed to Nazareth? Okay, partly because it was predicted in Micah 2. So you see that. We could go into great detail on that, Matthew 2:6. But why Bethlehem? Because that's where David was born. That's where David lived. And that's really the only time Bethlehem has any notoriety in the Old Testament is Micah 5:2. And it's specifically announcing a king is going to be born there, because that's where David was born. Revelation 5:5, he is this anointed one who's coming from the tribe of Judah. When Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, what's that drawing on? David is the sort of consummate shepherd king, and now he's the better David. And so there's a lot of different ways we could talk about the messianic kingship of Jesus. Because it's Christmas, we're going to go to the Magi. And why do the Magi show up in Jerusalem? Where are they from? And why am I saying Magi as opposed to wise men? Kate was like, don't burst all their bubbles. But then she's going to do it in ROC. So it's okay. So Sydney was one of the Magi in their church, in the Christmas play. And I was like, fine, you can say wise man. It's not really wise man, actually. The Magos, does anyone know what a Magos is in the ancient world? Magician, but not in the sort of David Blaine sense, or I don't know, Simon and Garfunkel. One of them's still alive, right? One of them died, didn't get eaten. Oh, not Simon and Garfunkel. That's it. Yeah, they're musicians. Who am I thinking of? No, the Las Vegas dudes with the Tigers. Yeah, Siegfried and Roy. Totally different than Simon and Garfunkel. One of them got eaten, apparently. Anyway, what are we talking about? So Magi were pagan astrologers and sort of soothsayers, most likely from Persia. And so that would have been roughly 1,000 miles from Bethlehem. And the reason why they go and chat with King Herod in Jerusalem is this. Where is he who has been born king, there we go, king, of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. Now the word there, when it rose, is anatole. And King James tradition Bibles, they're not going to say when it rose. What are they going to say? And in fact, what does Charlie Brown say? Or Linus, I guess. In the east. That's a bad translation. It's probably not what it means. It's plural if it's in the east. It's anatolone. In the singular, I think NIV, NASB, ESV get it better. We saw the star in its rising. So they see this star from Persia and like, wait a second. We need to go find a new Jewish king. Now, why on earth would a pagan astrologer in, I don't know, central Persia, when they see this astral phenomenon, go to Jerusalem of all places? It wasn't that big of a deal. Why didn't they go to Rome? Why didn't they go to some other place, Athens? Probably because they read the Bible. In fact, Magi in their day, sort of like Zoroastrian and so forth, would specialize in reading religious texts of other people. And that was very, very popular in Persia. And who had taken the Bible to the Babylonia-Persia area? The Jews during the exile. And in fact, who is considered a magos by some Jews? Balaam. And who is Balaam? The dude who talked the donkey. He's the guy who makes a prophecy in Numbers 24. And this is what he says in Numbers 24. Now, he's a bad guy in general, but the Spirit was on him to make this prophecy. He says, I see him, someone who's coming, but not now. So he's not here yet. I behold him, but not near. A star shall rise from Jacob, and his scepter shall rise out of Israel. Now, keep in mind, we're in Numbers. Does Israel have a king yet? No. They're wandering around the wilderness trying to make their way to the promised land. And Balaam is not an altogether savory fellow, as you find out, for instance, in Jude and Revelation, other places. But he makes a pretty true prophecy here that he sees a him, a person who's going to come to be the ruler. And how does he describe him? It's a metaphor, a star rising, and the word there is anatole. It's just a verbal form. And so most would argue that the Magi, who would have seen perhaps Balaam as their sort of ancestral, because he was from the ancient Near East, he wasn't Jewish. He was also kind of this magician, soothsayer, astrologer type. And Jews like Philo call him sort of the first magos, that maybe the Magi would have said, oh, we are familiar with this oracle by our sort of ancestral, the sort of OG magos. Balaam talking about a Jewish king when a star rises. Y'all with me on that? That's why they go to Jerusalem. In other words, Numbers 24:17 is a very cryptic, very important messianic prophecy. Never quoted in the New Testament, but it's narrativized through the Magi. Yeah.
Did they think of it as an actual star, or did they actually did they get the allusion to the star being a person?
They would have, well, I think it's both. I mean, there was an actual astral phenomenon that was significant enough that it caught people's attention. There's debate about what exactly it was. Was it, Mars in retrograde or whatever? And so we don't know for sure. But seeing that and sort of heavenly phenomena were pretty common in the ancient world to sort of say, oh, a new Caesar has been born or what have you. But it prompted them to say, oh, wait a second. We've seen an oracle to this effect. Let's go to the capital of Israel to see if this has come true. Does that make sense? So it's sort of a both. All right. Priest and sacrifice. Now, we've already talked about Jesus is from whose direct lineage? David. And David is from what tribe? Judah. Is Judah the priestly tribe? No. In fact, Hebrews says, wait a second, Moses didn't say anything about priests coming from Judah's tribe. Well, what non-Levite priest shows up somewhat cryptically in the Old Testament? Our best buddy, Melchizedek. Melchizedek shows up. He comes on the scene basically 2 verses of Genesis 14. He is both priest and king, incidentally. And then the only other time he makes a cameo is Psalm 110. You'll be a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And that's all you get in the Old Testament about this guy. You get basically 3 verses. Now, there's a whole lot of lore that develops around Melchizedek in Jewish literature. But it is, and so you're like, when you get to Hebrews 5, you're like, who is this guy that Hebrews keeps talking about? There's like 3 whole chapters about Melchizedek as the sort of prototype for Christ being a priest not from this traditional lineage, but from the line of Melchizedek. And so you got to know the backstory of old Melchizedek in Genesis 14 and Psalm 110 to make any sense. He just keeps going to Genesis 14 and Psalm 110 over and over again. If you read Hebrews 5 through 7, it's like he just keeps hammering Melchizedek tithes through Abraham and all these kinds of things. And so that shapes his identity as priest because he's not a Levite. He's from a different line. And then we could also talk about a lot of different ways in the New Testament. They use Old Testament language to describe Jesus as the great sacrifice. What is the first thing, at least in John's gospel, that John the Baptist says about Jesus when he rolls onto the scene? He says, look, there is behold the Lamb of God. Now, he doesn't explain which lamb. It could be the Passover lamb. It could be a different kind of lamb. But you see that with John the Baptist. And so he's really packing in the entire Old Testament sacrificial system into the identity of Jesus. And then Jesus is explicitly called the Passover in 1 Corinthians 5:7. He is our Pascha. And so there's a bunch of other places you could look into that in terms of this Old Testament sacrifice. He's also called the sin offering in Romans 8:3, using a technical term that is directly from Leviticus. And there's a bunch more we could get into. So in other words, Jesus is both priest and sacrifice. And by the way, he's also what, according to John? Where do priests work? He's in a temple. And generally the New Testament describes us as the temple, but there's this one place in John where he was speaking about the quote-unquote temple of his body. And so Jesus is also the kind of consummate temple as well. Let's move on. I think we're hit two more. Son of Man. Now, Son of Man, who refers to himself as Son of Man in the New Testament? Jesus, and it's somewhat unique. Over 80 times he refers to himself as Son of Man. He's only referred to Son of Man twice outside the Gospels. Anyone know the two places where they would call him Son of Man, or who calls him Son of Man? One, he is called Son of Man twice in Revelation. Good. And then where's the one place else? In the book of Acts. Very tragic scene. Stephen is being stoned, and he sees a glimpse of heaven, and he sees the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. And so there's a whole bunch of debate about why Jesus calls himself, quote unquote, Son of Man. But for our purposes this morning, I just want to point to multiple times, and I've given you the list here, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Revelation, they all use Daniel 7, 13, and 14 as the source of Son of Man. Now, the other 70 some odd times, they don't quote the passage. Jesus just calls himself Son of Man. But these are determinative to understand what that phrase means. And Susan, I know you know the answer to this because you were in my Revelation class faithfully. And basically the book, our study of Revelation for 20 some odd weeks was just reading Daniel. Who is the Son of Man in Daniel 7, 13, and 14? I'm putting you on the spot, but I know you can come through for us. What's the scene in Daniel 7? You can phone a friend if you need to. I know Ted probably knows. Y'all are both here for that. What's going on in Daniel 7? Heavenly vision, Ancient of Days, thrones are placed, and into the presence of the throne room comes one like a Son of Man. He presents himself to the Ancient of Days, and he is given eternal dominion over a kingdom. So that's the basic background of Son of Man. And then lastly, the vindicated sufferer. And this is pretty important, and we'll land here. When Jesus talks about himself as Son of Man, and actually 3 times in Mark, something like 7 times in Luke, he anticipates that he's going to die. And in fact, he says multiple times, I will be rejected, I will suffer so that Scripture could be fulfilled. Or in Luke 24, he says, as it is written, the Christ to suffer and rise again. So in other words, according to Jesus and many New Testament authors, the Old Testament anticipated the suffering and death of Jesus. But what's the problem? If you know your intertestamental Jewish Christology or Messianology. There's not a lot of places in the Old Testament where a eschatological deliverer is going to suffer and die. So the Son of Man in Daniel 7 doesn't die. In fact, you would be hard-pressed to find a Messiah passage in the Old Testament, and you certainly would be hard-pressed to find a Messiah passage in intertestamental literature that explicitly dies or even suffers in some way. And so there's been a long-standing question in New Testament and Old Testament scholarship is, what is Jesus talking about when he says the Old Testament anticipated that I would suffer and die? Y'all with me on that? I mean, find a verse that talks about a Messiah king who's going to die. You'd be hard-pressed to find it. This explains why the disciples were surprised. They expected him to sort of roll into Jerusalem, right? That's why I was like, oh yeah, put the palm branches down, that kind of thing. That's great. We were hiking yesterday and walking on palm branches, and Sydney started saying, I am Jesus. I'm like, yep, nope. But it's just us, so it was okay. I just made it public, though. The sisters were like, no, you can't say that. Plus, it's not Palm Sunday. Anyway, they had a lot of expectations that were met by Jesus, but they were completely floored that he died, right? Because they weren't expecting it based on the Old Testament. So we have to sort of dig a little bit deeper to figure out, where does the Old Testament give us a pattern for the suffering of someone? I'm going to give you 3. The first pattern that the Old Testament gives us is the mistreatment of the prophets. Some of the prophets had relatively stable lives, like Isaiah. And I guess Daniel you could throw in there, because he did get fed to lions and so forth. So I guess he did suffer a fair bit, but he had a pretty good court position. Not all of them suffered, but some of them really did. Elijah, what happened to him? Yeah, I mean, Jezebel's straight trying to kill the guy. He put a fatwa on his head. I mentioned this guy early, Micaiah, so not the same one as the prophet Micah, but he is directly killed. Elisha was made fun of by the young boys, and what did he do? They were making fun of his balding, right? And what does he do? Straight calls some bears to maul the guys. Jeremiah is in prison multiple times. He's thrown in pits. He's put in the stocks. They sent him to Egypt. He's treated poorly. Uriah the prophet, not Uriah the one that David had killed, he was also persecuted. And then the final one is Zechariah, again, not the writing prophet, but the son of Jehoiada. He was killed in the temple courts. So you have a whole cadre of prophets who are mistreated. And interestingly, when Jesus is on his final trip to Jerusalem, he refers to that. He says, Jerusalem, you always do this, right? You always kill the prophets that are sent to you. And he says, far be it for a prophet, i.e. me, to not die outside of Jerusalem. So he is marching to his death. In other words, though they're not concrete predictions, there's a pattern. If Jesus is the great prophet, he's going to follow the same pattern. Does that make sense? Of prophets who are mistreated by the people of Israel, many of whom are actually killed. And so Jesus actually says that directly in Luke 13. What's the one that you do know? That you, whenever you're like, wait a second, there are places that they do prophesy someone who's suffering. Suffering servant, right? And the reason why I didn't mention that was that the suffering servant is not called Messiah. He's not called prophet. He's not called king. He's not even a priest. So it's a different image, and that's important to sort of get the fullness. Not everything gets crammed into the title Messiah, but no doubt Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12, very near and dear. I think we sometimes will read this during Easter. God speaks of a servant who's exalted but rejected, and he is going to be stricken for your iniquities and that kind of thing. And what's interesting is that with the exception of 1 Peter 2 that does quote a chunk of it, it's never, you would think that this would be like the place they would all go all the time. Like, why aren't there sermons on this whole thing? Why don't you have the entire chapter? Because it reads like the gospel. We don't have that, but what you do have is nearly every line reflected somewhere in the New Testament. And I've given you the examples here where, with the exception of a few clauses here and there, you can reproduce almost the entire suffering servant song from the New Testament. And so it was significant. For me, that shows you that it's actually super significant for their construal of the identity of Jesus. Some would say, oh, wait a second, they didn't really quote it at length, and therefore it wasn't important. I'm like, no, the fact that they didn't quote it at length, but quoted all of it in fragments shows you just how entrenched it was in their ideology of this sufferer who's going to redeem Israel. And then the last one is the psalmist. When Jesus is in the garden, when Jesus is on the cross, what are his words? Tyler. Okay, so on the cross he says that, and then what does he say in the garden? No, but you're close. He does say that, but he says, my heart is grieved, and sort of to the point of anguish. Both of those are from Psalms, Psalm 22 and Psalm 31, yeah. And there's some other places in the New Testament where the words of Psalms are spoken by Jesus, which, by the way, we saw that already with Psalm 40. But in the Psalms, particularly the Psalms of Lament, you have a recurring pattern where the psalmist, whether it's David or someone else, is suffering greatly. They've cast lots for my clothing. That's not original to Jesus. That's from the Psalms, Psalm 22. Or they wag my head as they walk by. That's from Psalm 22. That's not just unique to Jesus and Matthew. And so the Psalms and this particular righteous person who pleads with God to say, deliver me, that's also a very important paradigm for the suffering of Jesus. And in fact, he takes the very words on his lips and said, these are my Psalms. I'm the one who's suffering, and I'm the one who's waiting for God to deliver me. So I'll leave you with this thought, final slide. What I find particularly interesting about this angle of New Testament Christology is that when you read Jewish literature, there's just fragments of ideas. Oh, we want a Messiah, we want a prophet, we want a wisdom, we want this king, whatever. And you have these sort of incoherent, not fully drawn together ideas that are kind of bouncing around, which leads to a lot of debate about, okay, what do we make of all of that? What I find particularly interesting, and all of them are from the Old Testament, but what the New Testament does is unite all of those in one person. That's the great aha moment with Christ, is that he takes all these seemingly disparate threads of Melchizedek and a star from Israel and that kind of thing. And he unites them all in one person, which causes you to reflect, well, what kind of person could be the mega eschatological deliverer beyond a divine person? He can unite all of these things in himself. So I'll leave you with that thought. Next class, next week, we're going to talk about the Old Testament and your identity as a Christian. Thank you. We are done because we're out of time. See you next week. I had to skip it for time. But you want to look